Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Mark Wilson, the President and CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. I'd also like to thank Senator Thrasher for your good bill and for having the courage to stand up against the status quo and for those that would try to defend it. We appreciate that. The discussion on teacher performance pay is a recommendation of the Florida Council of 100 and the Florida Chamber of Commerce in our recent publication, Closing the Talent Gap. So I stand here before you today to talk about something that we've been working on for years, and that is not the status quo, but to talk about the next 10 years, the next 20 years, and the context from within. I hope that we can all look at this conversation. We strongly support this good legislation because it's an improvement to our state education system, quite frankly, because of the important connection between the economic development discussion that we're having in this state, as well as the talent supply and the education discussion. Our state's economic development leaders, our state's workforce leaders are talking throughout the state about what the world looks like today, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, and what can we do in Florida to better position Florida for global competition. I want to give you a picture of what we're talking about. If Florida were a country today, our economy, we would have the 20th largest economy in the world. So if we look globally at Florida, I want to give you a couple examples of what's happened over the last 30 years, over the next 30 years. It's very relevant to the tough choice that you have in front of you today. Two parts of this. 30 years ago, Florida was the 5th cheapest place to live in the United States, 30 years ago. Education didn't matter nearly as much when you're 5th cheapest in the country as where you are today. We've gone from 5th cheapest to the 19th most expensive cost of living in the United States. Folks, it used to be about low wage, low skill. In the future, Florida will compete not on low wage, low skill, low cost of living. We will compete on diversifying our economy and higher wages, higher skills. Another example, the speaker before me gave international examples, and I think international examples are the perfect examples to use. India graduates more English-speaking engineers every year than the United States graduates college students. We need to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. And to make it personal, my 3 kids are going to grow up in a world not where they compete against kids in Georgia or in Alabama, but they're going to grow up in a world where they're competing against kids in India, kids in China, and kids in Canada. Today's 6th graders, for example, will enter the workforce in the year 2020. So members, I want to point out that the decisions you're making today are not about you, and they're not about me, and they're not about the advocates of the status quo. The decisions that we're making today are decisions that are going to impact the next economy. And decisions we're making today are going to decide whether or not you're making a decision to reposition Florida as a global competitor in that worldwide economy of talent, or whether we're going to continue to have Florida stay where it is. The Florida Chamber of Commerce thanks you for your time, and we ask you to support this good legislation. Thank you.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lawson.
Yeah, I would like to know what you mean about the status quo. I haven't heard anyone talk about the status quo in the last month or so. And then you're saying that we don't need to listen to the people who are talking about the status quo. What do you mean by the status quo? I don't quite understand.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Senator, for your question. The conversation we're trying to put on the table is that the world is changing, Florida is changing, and the education decisions that we've made over the last 30 years have worked over the last 30 years. The rest of the world is changing, and Florida needs to move to a higher wage, higher skill economy. And so those that would fight against job creation ideas we discussed yesterday, or higher standards that we've discussed and you've debated, or fight against the ability to recruit great teachers and reward great teachers for great accomplishments. That is the status quo that we're talking about, Senator.
Okay, may I respond? I don't want you to go away with a misconception. For the last 28 years that I've served in the legislature, the legislators in this state, from the House to the Senate, have always talked about raising standards, about having quality teachers, about changing the curriculum, about a global economy that was coming. And I have not been working with legislators, and I don't know, maybe some of the other people have, but I don't know any legislators that I worked with in the last 28 years that have been talking about maintaining the same level, not looking at the global economy, not wanting to compete on an international basis, not wanting to change the curriculum, not wanting to recruit the best teachers. So I just want the chamber to understand is that what you have just presented to us is something that the legislature have always wanted to do, and legislation to come out every year. We've had educational leaders in the Senate who started working on this over 20-some years ago. And we've had legislation that has been passed. We have educational leaders even on this committee that is committed to putting Florida and its students into the upper quotile among other states, and committed to having the most high quality education there is. So I think you might want to change your term about the status quo, because I don't know how to function in that, because everything that we've tried to do have been able to move to another level.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.